Welcome, everybody. It's good to see everyone here.
Do you want to use the mic?
No, can you hear me back there? I have a pretty
Good teaching voice.
I can walk up and down the aisle. My name is Mary Van Buren, and I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology and Geography. And I'm also the president of the local chapter of the American Association of University Professors. And this event is part of a 3-event series on labor and democracy that was sponsored by the AAUP, the College of Liberal Arts at CSU, AFL-CIO, UCW, and CoWINS. So
Northern Colorado.
and Northern Colorado, see it. AFL-CIO, I thought. It's my great pleasure to introduce our guest today. Dr. Windham from Georgetown University. Lane is the Associate Director of the Kamenowitz Institute for Labor and the Working Poor, and she's also the co-director of Women Innovating Labor Leadership. She's a labor organizer, educator, historian, and activist, and among her many accomplishments is her book, Knocking on Labor's Door, Union Organizing in the 1970s and the Roots of a New Economic Divide, which won the Organization of American Historians David Montgomery Award. Lane is also a frequent commentator in the media and has published in the Washington Post, the American Prospect, The Hill, and many other outlets. She will be speaking today about the post-1970s weakening of the labor movement, its recent resurgence, and pathways forward. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Windham. Yes.
Hey, let's see. All right. Yes, can you hear me in the back? I'm going to use the mic. It's a little bit easier on my voice. So thank you for having me. I have really enjoyed my stay so far and at Colorado State University. Thank you to Demetrius and to Mary for having me, for Brendan to driving me around, and to all the folks that I've been meeting. I also just want to give a shout out that we have a number of representatives of the labor movement here today, including, I just want to note that Alejandra Beatty is here, who is the brand new president of the Boulder Area Labor Federation, and who went through the Will Empower program, which Alejandra, if I forget to do it, remind me to tell the folks about our Will Empower program before this is over. And I just want to note that today is part of Labor Spring, which is a series of more than 70 events happening on college campuses and in communities across the country. They're all focusing on worker justice. And so this event is one of those, and that's anchored at this center at Georgetown. So before I became a historian, I was a union organizer in the South. And then I later worked with the National AFL-CIO and then went back to grad school. And so what I'm going to do today is kind of wear both those hats. I'm going to be with you as a labor historian and an academic, but I still always think of myself in many ways as a union organizer. So I'm going to wear kind of both hats as I'm talking with you. And my title today is Workplace Democracy, Inequality, and the Future of Labor. And what I plan to do is examine the core dilemma that workers' unions are key to a strong democracy. Yet in the US, union membership remains at a historic low. Why, and what are the paths forward? And so we're going to talk about sort of how we got there and where I think we're going. We are currently living through an upsurge in worker action. I've been in or around the labor movement for 30 years, and I have just never seen anything like this, right? We've had all the strikes last year with UAW, the SAG-AFTRA, the Teamsters, although they didn't end up striking. And then, of course, all the organizing, again, UAW organizing, we've seen the huge waves at like Amazon, Trader Joe's, Alphabet Workers Union, which Alejandra was part of. here in Colorado, I've been meeting people from Colorado Winds, AAUP, the United Campus Workers. Let's see. Page, yes. And you know, I saw that workers, I just Googling it for Colorado, I learned that workers at Meow Wolf organized, which is pretty cool, in the Denver Art Museum. So it's definitely hopping. And those of you who are involved in this are really in good company. There's been just lots of organizing, not only on campuses, but also among journalists, architects, nurses, museum workers, nonprofit workers, and more. Unions are popular. You may have already seen this, but Gallup polling shows that 67% of Americans approve of unions, the highest level in nearly 50 years. It's even higher among young people. A recent study by the Center for American Progress showed that Gen Z is the most pro-union generation alive. They are more pro-union than were boomers, Gen Xers, or millennials at their same age. So give it up, right, for Gen Z. Okay, so like, why? Why is all this happening now? Well, the pandemic, of course, was key. Remember, we all celebrated essential workers, and then we watched as they went back to those same old dead-end jobs with no respect. I think in many ways, ideas about what is acceptable on the job have just fundamentally changed. But I think the upsurge in worker action is actually part of a larger shift in our social and economic order. What historian Gary Gersel has called, quote, the fall of the neoliberal order. It's part of a shift in ideas. Now, I'm not entirely sure that we can bury neoliberalism yet, right? It doesn't seem to have completely fallen. But my larger point here is that I think we probably all sense that there's a big shift happening, a big shift in the social, the political, the economic order that shapes our world. And this shift, I think, began before the pandemic. I think it started with the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. This is when new diverse movements began to call for greater equity. We had the Occupy movement of 2011, the Black Lives Matter movement of 2013, the Me Too movement in 2017, the Day Without an Immigrant in 2017, and it all grew from a new rights consciousness. Even before the pandemic, workers were demanding more equity. Remember all those Red for Ed strikes, right? In fact, even here in Colorado in 2018. Meanwhile, I'm sure as Demetrius could tell us, ideas about the climate are also key. Wildfires, floods, heat waves, all make us see like, okay, we need to make deep systemic changes here, right? And this is, of course, also inspired the youngest among us. But of course, challenges also come from the right. We've seen global political backlash that includes the rise of Donald Trump, the Capitol rioters, you know, you've seen it around the world on other right-wing populist fronts. So we're in a moment when we are really seeing two competing visions for the future when we're at this moment of shift. Some of those ideas are neo-authoritarian, they're anti-democratic, they're fundamentally elitist. Others are more egalitarian, and many of the people in this room are fighting for that world. They envision a strong democracy in which working people have power, the planet survives, and the common good is central. So my main argument here today is that if the US is going to build that second future, the one that serves the larger common good, democratic worker organizations have to be part of that. But here's our dilemma. Union membership remains stuck at a very low level. Even with the upsurge in strikes and organizing, union density, or the percentage of the workforce that has a union, is about 10%. and 6% in the private sector, which is the same level as it was in 1900. Okay, so how could that be, right? Why is union membership so low when interest in unions is so high? And what would it take to change it? So today I'm going to describe unions' role in undergirding democracy. We'll then talk about how it became so difficult for working people to form unions in this country. And we'll talk about the 1970s, which were a pivotal decade, and when a newly diversified working class fought for and lost full access to unions. I'll then make the case for stronger labor laws, and I will explain why those laws must be embedded within a more universalized social safety net. And then I'll finish with some reflections on why some of the current working class activity, both within unions and beyond, holds promise for the future, not only for the working class, but also for our democracy. Okay, so let's start there with democracy. Why, some may ask, do we even need unions in a world in which there is just less and less industry? I often hear this, from journalists, aren't unions kind of a thing of the past? The evidence is clear that unions undergird democracy. They curb inequality. They give working people a functional knowledge on a grassroots level how democracy works. And third, they bring democracy to the workplace and balance corporate power. Okay, so let's start with inequality and how it fundamentally undermines democracy. The core idea of democracy is everyone is equal, with equal standing, we're equal before the law, equal voices, equal influence. Inequality skews this system as so many social goods, political power, media influence, education flow to the rich. This is a chart from the Economic Policy Institute, which shows the inverse relationship between union membership and income inequality. In the decades following World War II, when unions were stronger, inequality shrank. When unions were weaker, inequality grew. Well, there's obviously more happening in this period, especially in the 1970s on. There's new technology, there's globalization, but weakening unions mattered too. Research shows that deunionization explains a third of the growth of the wage gap between high and middle wage earners over the 1979 to 2017 period. This is another EPI chart, and it shows that if collective bargaining and unions had remained as strong as they were in the 1970s, workers today would earn $3,250 more for a full-time, full-year worker. And in fact, a new 2023 Treasury Department study found that unions raised the wages of their members by about 10 to 15%, and also close race and gender gaps. So you can see that it's especially true for women and for people of color. So, all right. So one way that unions undergird democracy is by curbing economic inequality, which in turn boosts trust in the political system. The problem, of course, is that too few people have access to that economic benefit of a union contract. Okay, unions also model democracy in action. When I was a union organizer, I really saw this. I saw how unions allowed working people to fully engage in democracy. They were often young people, and sometimes not so young people, when we were organizing on the campaigns, who'd never voted, right? For whom the entire political system seemed to be far away and remote. But through their union, their opinion mattered, their vote mattered. They served as stewards, elected representatives. They not only voted, but they ran for office. Being in a union was for them a lived experience of the democratic process. And then through their union, they got involved in politics, they registered to vote, they engaged in the civic process. In fact, unions serve as, quote, schools of democracy, according to Theda Skocpol and Lainey Newman in their new book, Rust Belt Union Blues. In this close-up look at Western Pennsylvania steel unions, Skocpol and Newman argue that unions did more than sway members to vote in their heyday in the 1950s and 60s. They offered community and social identity ties that encouraged members to be civic participants and shaped their political outlooks. So Skocpol and Newman show, that union halls were like at the center of communities. People held weddings there and celebrations. But as unions declined, those union halls have since been replaced by gun clubs, by mega churches. And they make the case that this vacuum left by unions' absence leaves democracy more vulnerable to populist extremism. If anybody here has read their book, I'll be curious to hear what you think about it. I think it's got some interesting points. Unions also bring a democratic worker voice to America's workplaces, which remain among the least democratic spaces in the developed world. US workplaces are among the least democratic spaces in the developed world. For example, the US is nearly alone among developed nations in still having at-will employment. What that means is that most workers can be fired at any time for any non-discriminatory reason, unless they are covered by a union contract. We often don't think that's true, right? We think that couldn't be, but it is true. Philosopher Elizabeth Anderson argues that US workplaces are authoritarian private governments in which workers cede all rights, right? So unions reinsert workers' democratic voice in the workplace and balance outsized corporate power. When I was a union organizer in the 1990s, I spent a lot of time in working people's living rooms, often in tiny and pretty isolated Southern towns. And I found that what motivated people to want to form a union, yes, it was money, yes, it was the benefits, but they really wanted a voice at work. The way they would say it is, I respect or a say at work. And the biggest issue was how they did their work. This leaflet is from a place in northern Florida called McClinney Products. It was a cutting shop. And I just want to point out Dolores Belford's reason for wanting a union. She's the one in the top left corner. Dolores Belford said, "I want a union because I'm sick and tired of being treated like the way we've been treated. I'm tired of still being in the $5 range after 5 years. I'm tired of being lied to by supervisors. In fact, I want to sit right across the table from Grisham and Bob Baer, who are the top manager and the company owner." So McClinney was still a very segregated, small Southern town, and Black women did not sit across any table from white men in that town. But Belford had a vision for something different, that a union would mean a more democratic and equal work experience. And they did end up winning their union there. Yeah. When people have agency at work, there's a spillover effect. They expect more agency in the rest of their lives too. Unions can serve as a check on the alienation and disempowerment that marks so many workplaces, especially low-wage workplaces in the US. Okay, so if unions are such a beacon of democracy, then why isn't union membership on the rise? The current wave of union organizing has not yet reversed a more than 70-year slide in the percentage of US workers who want a union. You can see that here. Unions are now less able to play this crucial role in undergirding US democracy because they have been so weakened by employer attacks during the neoliberal period, from the 1970s to the early 21st century, and labor law has been too weak to stop that. So to explain this dilemma, I'm going to take you into the 1970s, because this decade was a turning point, and it marked the beginnings of the neoliberal period and that would govern the rest of the century. And for this part of the discussion, I'm going to pull from my book, Knocking on Labor's Door. Union membership took a sharp turn downward in the early, starting in the 1970s. At the start of the decade, about a quarter of workers in the private sector had unions. By the mid-1980s, private sector union density would be cut nearly in half to 14%. Today, union density is at a historic low, like I said before, 6% in the private sector, 10% overall. Okay, so when explaining the decline of union density in the pivotal 1970s, many academics and journalists place the blame squarely on what they portray as bureaucratic unions, which they say were complacent, and also on working people who they believe lost interest in organized labor. This is a direct quote from a textbook that there were, quote, no great organizing drives were undertaken by major national unions or the AFL-CIO itself for decades. One historian even claims that the 1970s were the last days of the working class. But this didn't seem right to me, because I had been a union organizer. And when I began to do research for my dissertation and then this book, I knew many working class people absolutely wanted unions. The problem is it's so hard to get them. So I began to take a closer look at the numbers. What I did is I looked at the statistics in a different way. I did not just count yes votes when I looked at National Labor Relations Board elections. Instead, I counted all the people who tried to form unions, whether they won or not. So these are eligible voters in labor board elections. It turns out that roughly 5 million workers voted in National Labor Relations Board union elections in the 1970s, 500,000 a year, the same pace as in labor's heyday in the 1950s and 60s. What you're looking at here is the number of voters in union elections from 1949 to 1999, and I'll draw your attention to the middle, the mid-50s through about 1982, when it drops like a rock. Meanwhile, of course, this is just private sector. There's another 3 million public sector workers who signed up for unions in this decade. So, in fact, what I discovered when I began to dig a little bit into the archives is there was a wave of millions of working people who came knocking on labor's door in the 1970s. They tried to organize unions in the private sector, including throughout the South. Many of the people leading these drives were women and people of color who were just entering the workforce. They had long been excluded from the nation's best jobs and from many of the nation's unions, but they had won new access through the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So it turns out that this decade was far from the last days of the working class. Instead, these were the first days of a transformed, diversified, and newly activated working class. In fact, as these women and people of color, many of them young people, as they poured into those jobs, those newly opened jobs, they demanded unions. They didn't just want a job, right? They wanted a really good job. So they were people like Henry Davison, who left his hometown of Monroe, Louisiana in 1965 because he couldn't find anyone willing to hire a Black man at a decent wage. He returned home in 1976 and landed a job at a GM plant, and then he organized it. So here he is, pictured with his family on the left, his coworkers on the right. There's lots of surprising union victories in this decade. Workers at the Midwest Stock Exchange unionized, as did thousands of hospital workers. Workers at the first foreign auto transplant, VW, in Westmoreland, Pennsylvania, organized. Even security guards who worked for Pinkerton, the notorious strike-breaking firm, won a union in the 1970s. Black workers were by far the most likely workers to say that they wanted a union. Now, it is important to recognize that many unions were still reluctant to accept Black members. Unions were very slow to open up staff and leadership positions to Black workers. Many African-American workers had to file EEOC charges to win equal access. But African-American workers wanted unions. A full 70% of African-American blue-collar workers said they would form a union if given a chance. Women powered the new wave of union organizing. Women poured into the nation's workplaces in the 1970s, and many joined unions. In 1960, only 18% of union members were women. By 84, that figure was 34%. Hispanic workers were more likely than the general population to be in a union. This image on the left is from the FARA clothing campaign in Texas. This was 3,000 mostly native-born Latina workers walked out and demanded a union recognition. It ended up sparking a nationwide boycott of FARA. The image on the right is from a major strike in 1982 in New York City among garment workers. 20,000 workers, many Chinese and Puerto Rican workers, took to the streets, mostly women. Okay, again, so if what happened, right? If so many workers wanted unions, then why are we in this position now? Like, why didn't the US labor movement grow? And why don't we have many, many more union members than we have? So there's lots of reasons for this. Again, globalization, technological change mattered. But the fact that workers could not freely form unions also fed the nation's economic divide. What I discovered is that workers absolutely were organizing. Workers did want unions. What declined was workers' ability to win those elections. Okay, so I know that many people in the room know this in terms of the process for forming a union through the National Labor Relations Board, but just in case, I'm going to give a reminder of the rather onerous process for forming a union through the National Labor Relations Board. If workers at a workplace want to have a union, first 30% have to sign union cards. Usually the unions wait till at least 50% have signed cards. You then take the cards to the federal government, to the board. They then schedule an election, which is usually 8 to 12 weeks. Lately, it's gotten a little faster under this board. During this time, the employer has free access to hold meetings, to campaign against the union. The union has no access inside the workplace. The vast majority of employers fight the effort. About a third fire workers. Over half threaten to move, half threaten to cut wages and benefits. There are no fines. So employers began then to shut the door on new union organizing in the 1970s in a new way, at a new level. Three things changed on this front. First, employers became far more willing to bend and break the law. The number of unfair labor practice charges against employers doubled in this decade, as did the number of illegal firings. What you're seeing here are unfair labor practice charges against employers from the 1950s through the 1990s. And you can see that dramatic rise in the 1970s through the early 80s. The second thing that happened was that even unionized employers at the core of the economy, companies like GM, US Steel, and Goodrich, began to viciously fight their workers' efforts to unionize. And third, employers began to rely much more heavily on union busters, who closely advised employers how to thwart organizing attempts, including educating managers on the low costs of striking and breaking the law, of skirting and breaking the law. And their efforts were extremely effective. While workers won roughly 80% of the union elections in the 1940s, by the late 1970s, they won less than half. So obviously, one answer to this predicament is to strengthen labor law. And we 100% absolutely need to do that. But in researching the book, I began to ask an underlying question, which was, well, why did employers attack unions so viciously starting in the 1970s? And I think this helps us understand what we need to do going forward. After all, while employers in the US had never loved unions, they did manage to have a kind of uneasy truce with them through the mid part of the 20th century. Well, it turns out that US employers faced a crisis of profit in a newly globalized and financialized capitalism. Labor costs were something they could more easily control in this new paradigm. So US employers had a huge incentive to resist union organizing because of the particular role that collective bargaining plays in the US's employer-centric social welfare system. Okay, so that's a mouthful, so I'm going to explain what I mean. A key part of American social contract is that a lot of our social welfare comes from our employers. What I mean by that is like our pensions, our health care. And it hasn't always been this way. This employer-provided system developed after World War II. It's different in other countries where the social safety net is either provided universally to all citizens or where employers maybe are required to provide those social benefits. The US never did that. We never said in our country, you have to provide these social benefits, as did other nations. Instead, all we said to employers is, you have to bargain over those social benefits with those workers who had jumped through all these hoops that it takes to get a union. At that point, then you have to talk to them about social benefits. Our system thus relies on unions and collective bargaining to do the kind of redistribution and social safety net that governments do elsewhere. When the employers faced a crisis of profit in the 1970s, they really wanted out of their social welfare obligations. Well, the best way out? Avoid the one entity in the US that can force you to play the role, which is a union and collective bargaining. So that employer-provided social welfare system has thus left unions and collective bargaining extremely vulnerable. It basically puts unions in the line of fire from employers. And in fact, employers' assault on unions was the first wave of their overall attack on the entire employment relationship. Employers began to hire far more part-time workers, temporary workers, subcontract out work. You know the story, push down labor standards, retreat from providing benefits, and eventually we get to the gig economy. But as I said at the outset, it is possible that we are at the start of something new, a turn away from that neoliberal thinking and the genesis of a new structure. So I'm excited to see a lot of echoes of the 1970s organizing in today's worker upsurge. Again, diverse groups of workers are demanding more, and again, they're led by the youngest workers. Again, workers are making a full-throated demand for their workplace rights, and perhaps this time they can win and build more power. But even with all the upsurge in strikes and organizing, our big problem remains. What we've been discussing, the New Deal systems that undergird unions have been so weakened during the neoliberal period that it has been very difficult for workers to use those New Deal tools to revive unions. We do need to shore up labor law. We need to defend it from attacks like from Amazon and Trader Joe's, who are challenging the very constitutionality of the National Labor Relations Board. But workers cannot just rebuild the New Deal system. It's becoming increasingly clear that 21st century unions must be embedded in a new system, a new structure that includes more universal, I think I skipped one, more universal social goods for everyone, not just for union members. This more universal structure takes unions a bit more out of the line of the employer fire when employers are trying to shed labor costs. Employers have less incentive to bust unions when unions no longer mean to bust union when unions no longer mean that they are carrying the cost of healthcare, retirement, paid leave, and more. A more universal social safety net also gives workers more breathing room, more of a stable base from which to exercise their collective power. And that could include more universal coverage for areas that aren't even covered by collective bargaining, like housing, childcare, and education. After all, US workers know at a visceral level how deeply beholden they are to their employers. The US's employer-provided social welfare system gives employers huge power over people's lives. When workers have more security from a stronger social safety net, when they are more free to exercise their right to be part of a democratic workers' organization. Maybe this sounds a little bit delusional, like a dream, right? Especially with today's Congress. How can you get anything through the Senate? But in fact, we already saw a version of this more universalized social safety net in the US, and it was during the pandemic. The government began to do even more than ever for its citizens. This was the largest peacetime expansion of the social welfare system in the US since the New Deal. We expanded Medicaid, we expanded unemployment to part-time workers, to independent contractors, to the self-employed. Bolstered by pandemic relief legislation, economic security programs cut child poverty by 76% in 2021. Overall, the government spent about $5 trillion since March of 2020. And what happened when workers had a little bit of breathing room? They began to organize and they began to strike. They were more free to exercise their labor rights. That pandemic era social safety net expansion is one factor alongside unemployment, alongside new ideas about work. One of the things that is underneath the labor activism that we're seeing today. And in fact, many labor groups are in the midst of a new era of experimentation on this expanded social safety net front. So let's see. Take housing, for instance. Unite here in Los Angeles recently fought for, though they didn't win, a 7% tax on hotel rooms that could be used to address the housing crisis, not just for their members, but for everybody struggling with the high cost of housing. The UFCW joined others in demanding an end to cold weather evictions in Tacoma, Washington. Teachers' unions have been demanding that school districts build housing that teachers and staff can afford. I was just in Boston, where I learned that the Boston Teachers Union, pictured here on the bottom left, has a housing justice committee and recently won a pilot program to address student homelessness. And they won that through contract negotiations. Here in Colorado, of course, and you all can tell me more about it, but I hear that there was a recent expansion of the social safety net. The first time a state passed a ballot measure for paid family leave, Proposition 118, which allows for 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave. This is very exciting that these benefits are portable. They don't wed people to a particular employer. And the labor movement was, of course, part of fighting for that. Minnesota offers an interesting example of a place where the labor movement has joined forces and aligned with other community groups to fight for an expanded social contract. And the other images on the slide are from Minnesota. After the Great Recession in 2009, the St. Paul Federation of Teachers pioneered a new approach to bargaining known as bargaining for the common good. They brought the community to their bargaining table and included issues beyond traditional bargaining. So, for instance, they talked about restorative justice practices. Then the union representing service workers, SEIU Local 26, aligned with community groups and began to build for political change. They formed a group called Minnesotans for a Fair Economy, who adopted one another's fights, and they even shared staff, which is really cool. 10 years later, there was a remarkable change, and amazing laws are coming out of the Minnesota legislature, including free meals for all public school students, enhanced wage theft protections for all construction workers, whether they have a union or not, paid family and medical leave, $1 billion for affordable housing, a restore the vote law that gave the vote back to 50,000 formerly incarcerated people, right? And this is all this deep, deep coalition work. This larger model was the model SEIU used actually when it supported the Fight for 15 model. And while this never won a federal increase to the minimum wage, many cities and states raised their minimum wages, as did many companies. And as a result, an estimated 26 million workers have won 151 billion in raises. And that, what was won through the Fight for 15, is also underneath the recent upswing in worker action, right? People have a little bit more on which to stand. Okay, so in conclusion, I'll just say, you know, again, I've been in the labor movement on and off or around it for 30 years. And often unions will say, yeah, that's all, it's all really good, but it's extra. It's something nice to do, but we have to do what we have to do, you know, serve our members, and then this other stuff is extra. It's not really our core fight. What I would argue is that the universal social benefits path isn't extra. It is the path out of the union membership dilemma. This is a dilemma we have not yet solved, right? Unions have not been able to solve it, even in an upsurge, a historic upsurge like the one we are living through, right? When workers have greater security in many areas of their lives, they have more of a stable base from which to organize, from which to take risks. When employers are not on the hook for higher health care, pension, and benefits cost, they have less of an incentive to target unions. And when workers build a labor movement that is far less centered around employers and the benefits that they provide, then their organizations are more free to be the strong democratic worker organizations that they need to be. And that is a role that is more vital than ever as the nation faces a deepening crisis of democracy. So I look forward to a robust discussion. So we'll just open it up. I have a mic here, which I can bring to you. And maybe what we'll do, if people have comments, you probably know each other, but I would love it if you would just tell the group who you are. And we're open for questions or comments or discussion. And I encourage folks to not just sort of talk to me, but talk to one another. You all have amazing stuff going on, which I've been learning about here in Colorado. I mean, just like there's lots of activity, both among unions, but also people taking on housing issues, taking on other issues. So I'd love to hear a discussion among you all too. So, okay, any questions or comments? I see one over here.
That was a really stimulating talk. Thank you so much for coming and for the talk. So, your point about how this employer provides the social security, the contradictions and problems posed. I mean, I think it's spot on. But there is an additional dimension to the problem, because not only are employers resisting unions because they are on the hook for all these services or whatever protections, they also oppose social spending by the state. There is this continuous pushback against state doing the stuff, whether it's universal healthcare or whatever. At every stage you have this opposition. And there's a reason for that too, because while they don't like to be on the hook for it, when the state provides it, the workers precisely have a stronger base on which to organize. So it's really not the battle. I just want to know what your thoughts about that.
Yeah. Yes. And in fact, I would say not only do employers often resist the expansion of social benefits, they also rely on them. I mean, right? I mean, how many of these employers have so many low-wage workers who really are dependent on CHIP, they're dependent on Medicaid, they're dependent on so many services. And so, yeah, absolutely. And this is so much the US weird employer provided system that creates this contradiction. I see a hand back here.
Thank you, Lane, and enjoyed your talk today. Kevin Caffrey, Northern Colorado Labor Council. We're one of the sponsors of this event. What I've noticed, and this was a mystery to me, when I moved to Colorado, I'm from Nebraska. Now, don't hold that against me. I never heard of the Ludlow Massacre. It's not taught in school. We don't teach any labor issues in school. And so you have generation after generation growing up, they don't know anything about labor. Our papers used to have a large section that talked about labor. Now it's all sports and some more sports and then a little more sports and some more sports. So we've gone, you know, and everybody's dreaming in my whole neighborhood, all the kids, they're playing baseball, soccer, and they all think they're going to get scholarships. They're all going to be pros, and probably none of them are. So the bottom line of it is we have to get back to the basics. We have to talk about it in the papers or media, social media, and we have to get it back into our schools and talk. We have to talk about civics and we need to talk about labor. So, you know, what are your thoughts about how to get, and a lot of these places, including here, we have school boards that are very liberal. They don't even think in those lines, you know, and so how do we get that going again?
Well, I'm happy to take a shot at that. Is there anybody here who wants to take a shot for Colorado? Okay, right here. Introduce yourself.
I love that you actually brought that up because my name is Len Harris. I am the Young Worker and Community Organizer for the Colorado AFL-CIO. And one of my intentions for the upcoming years, hopefully next year, we'll see if the timeline works out, is to get a bill into the legislature to teach labor history in school curriculums. So that was actually a fantastically timed question. So weird, it's like we're colleagues somehow. But that's one of the things that I was thinking of to answer a piece of that question is to, you know, organize around bills in the legislature that I'm hoping to pass to get, again, the school curriculum to teach labor history. But my follow-up question to that would be, one of the biggest obstacles we have is funding. And especially in Colorado, we have a lot of issues with the excess taxes that are gathered during tax season and going back to taxpayers, which of course everyone loves to see a refund on their taxes. I don't blame them, but in a sense, they sort of miss the reality that they're actually paying more throughout the year for the services that those taxes that are refunded aren't paying for. So it's like, it's kind of like we hear with union busting, where an employer will say, you're going to have to pay dues at the end of the year. You might have paid $700 in dues. You could have bought a PS5 for that. So don't you want, you know, and then it's missing the point that you'd actually be making a lot more money with a union contract. It wouldn't matter. So I was wondering if you have any suggestions on what we could do to try to alleviate the issues of funding and how, you know, corporate executives and other corporate power have a lot of funding on their side to fight these initiatives like a bill in the legislature. And yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
So I can't fix Tabor. But, you know, I mean, this is a discussion, you all deal with this all the time. So I'm sure there are lots of thoughts on this in this room. Ultimately, the discussion that I was having in terms of the role that democratic worker organizations play in people's lives as an anchor for their civic participation, as an anchor for how they understand themselves in the world, right? And so but that gets us into our dilemma. It's hard to get those workers into our union so we can then have the conversation with them about Tabor, and we can then talk to them about who to vote for, all this, that's, in many ways, that's the core dilemma. And I think that we have to, so it's kind of, the answer is kind of what I was just describing, which is the way to have more people in our tent, to make it easier for people to be part of our unions, is that we have to, push for more of these universal issues. And so I don't know exactly what that means in Colorado. I was just in Boston, where I was giving a similar talk. And I gotta say, I was like getting up there thinking, oh, I don't know. Like, I don't know if the Boston unions are gonna, like, I don't know what they're gonna say when I say that we need universalized social contracts, So I was a little nervous, but I got up there and I did my talk. And it turns out that in Boston, like, they're already like doing the work. They have a group called Raise Up Massachusetts that's run and won in the last 5 years, not one, not two, but 4 ballot initiatives. They've raised the minimum wage twice. They've won paid leave, like y'all got in California. They won sick days. They also, that conference was full of worker cooperative people who have a close relationship with the labor movement in Boston. Like the Boston Labor Council holds a lot of its meetings at the worker co-op brew pub. And then there also was just a whole lot of effort among many unions there to fight on housing issues. So there's a housing justice committee at several unions. They were talking about it as part of their negotiations. And so I can't solve taper, right? Because it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg thing, but I do think that broadening our coalitions, taking a bargaining for the common good approach, that ultimately is the path. We cannot get there by trying to walk the narrow line of trying to win union members through this small little doorway that New Deal law allows for us. Like the employers have just really shut that down. So we have to have a more broad, and ultimately that's how you get to the mindset that is underneath taper, which is being mind, not community based. Yeah. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Becker. I work here at CSU and I'm a member of UCW. I am stuck there where on the graph where you show that there is increased interest in wanting to participate in union, especially among our younger generations. And it's a catch-22 because what I see, I interact with students a lot and we're all going through these things together. It's the issue of fear, Rita, because employers have so much power. And us as employees, and especially student employees, their futures depend on them being able to work. People are working 2-3 jobs because of income inequities, and that create workload inequities. And then now I'm speaking from a public health standpoint, mental health impact, which then makes it even harder to get people who want to use the little money they have to pay dues, and also to be able to take some time away from their 3 jobs and 4 children to try and come and participate in union activities. So what I'm wondering about is, in the 70s, how were they able to organize, especially among the working poor, because we are really poor now. We were poor in the 70s, now we are really, really poor in terms of we can't afford anything. I mean, I have a PhD, but I can't afford to buy a house. I can't afford a lot of things. So we did all the right things that we're asked to do, but we are still unable. We have to work 2-3 jobs to be able to save for just a house to live in. So I'm just wondering, how did you then people motivate people to say, even with the little you have, maybe, it's worth it. It's a worthy investment or something like that, some kind of inspirational thing. And also with the employer threats, right? The retaliation, the lack of accountability, those things make it really, really extremely hard to even. I mean, I don't blame people who are afraid because they have legitimate reasons to be. Sorry, that was a long, complicated question.
And yes, and exactly as I was describing, that employers have incredible power over working people because they not only control our paycheck, they also control our healthcare, they control our retirement, they control so many elements of our lives because we don't get that through our government and citizens, et cetera, et cetera. And so as US workers, we are really set up, and the whole thing I was describing about at-will employment too, right? We are just really set up to not have much power, right? And that has benefited and continues to benefit employers mightily. So you asked the question, well, how did people do it in the 70s? Well, they did and they didn't. Sometimes they were able to overcome the increased employer resistance, right? So I'll give you one example from the book. I write about a place called the Newport News Shipyard in Newport News, Virginia. The workers there won the largest labor board election ever in the US South. 19,000 workers formed a union in 1978. They then couldn't get a contract and they held a massive strike in 1979. And ultimately, they did win a union in part because it was under the Carter administration, and the administration leaned on this government provider basically to sign a contract. So they gave an extra oomph to labor law, right? Those workers really built off, it was started by 4 African-American men who had actually taken on the shipyard and filed civil rights charges, won a number of those charges, but still weren't making enough money compared to the other unionized shipyards. And so they said, you know what, it's not enough to have won equal access to bad jobs. Like we have to actually make them good jobs. And so that's why they demanded and won a union. But for that, that's a case where the workers actually won. But in case after case, workers tried and were not able to overcome the obstacles that employers, put up as they tried to form unions. When the employers fired people, they threatened people, et cetera, et cetera. And you mentioned fear. That fear is real. Like working people know, they know, I found as an organizer, they know that it's a risk. But I always knew at some level that someone was going to be a union activist on a campaign when they said some version of this. I came here looking for a job and I'll leave here looking for a job. And what that meant was that they were willing, despite all the, at-will employment, despite all the obstacles piled against them, they were willing to engage in collective action and be part of it. So, in the US, it's a huge effort to get over those obstacles and win the union. It's just the reality of the situation.
Sorry to take the mic again. I just wanted to speak a little with maybe a tangible example of something that really helped subvert some of that fear in my campaign at Starbucks, because that's how I got this job, was organizing Starbucks. And one of the things that SBWU, Starbucks Workers United, did is they had a solidarity fund. So ultimately what that was for workers that were fired or retaliated against and lost their jobs, or like I was illegally fired and I went to court over it and I won my court case. So that's awesome. But that didn't change the fact that for months I was out of work. And so Starbucks Workers United had a thing called the Solidarity Fund that I was able to apply for, and I got a good chunk of money. I say a good chunk, it was $2,500. Good for a person making what I made at Starbucks, enough to keep a roof over my head for like 2 months. But even then, as small as it was still significant for me, and it really helped subvert that fear for me. So my suggestion would be then to organize with community organizers, get in touch with your union leaders, just get in touch with anybody who's in an organizing realm, whether it's an organization for community or an organization for labor, and see what can be done about setting up these funds. Even if it's a small chunk of payment per member, or if you're just not even part of those memberships and you donate, having that sort of fund really helped be like, okay, at the very least, I have something available for me. And then I did have a question. These social safety nets, 100% agree, would love to see that happen soon. One of the things I was curious about, if you think it would coincide with this, is the 32-hour work week. Does that free up actual literal time enough for that to be a significant piece of this?
Yes. Nice. And, you know, the labor movement, that's what the labor movement has always fought for. We fought for the 10-hour day. And once we got that, we fought for the 8-hour day. So, you know, I think that at one point in the 1960s, 1970s, that experts would be shocked that by 2024, that US workers not only hadn't gotten to the 30-hour, 2-hour week with the increases in productivity, but workers were actually working more hours, right? And so, you know, because workers' wages have not been rising along with productivity, and neither has their time off. Yeah, I see another hand back here.
My name is Warren Snyder. I'm with the Northern Colorado Labor Council. One of the things that people seem to forget, union is in the Constitution. If you read the preamble, it says, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union." So you have to ask yourself, okay, could Rhode Island have defeated the strongest British Empire in the world? Could Delaware? No. So what do? They form a union. And when we have our union meetings, I don't do the pledge. I do the preamble to the Constitution to remind us of that.
Excellent.
I think, yeah, it's getting a little bit late. I
Okay.
know that some people have to go, but there's refreshments. It's a little bit late. Some people have to go, but there are refreshments here, coffee and lemonade and tea. Lots of cookies if you want people to eat. So if you'd like to ask Ling some questions and discuss things further amongst yourselves, please feel free to do so. Yes.
Just wanted to make the announcement, April 28th, that's a Sunday, Eudora Park, noon to 4. It's our May Day labor picnic. And we're gonna have food trucks there. There's gonna be candidates that are running for office, county, state, federal, and they're gonna be speakers. The candidates are gonna tell you if they're in the primary, why they're better than their opponent. And hopefully as many people here can come. You're all invited.
When is that?
Eudora Park, April 28th, noon to 4.
All right, thank you very much. And let's thank Ling again for her wonderful